In order to complete the process for evaluating the biocompatibility of biomedical devices, the last but very important stage is that of clinical trials. Successful completion of clinical trials provides approval for legal marketing of pertinent products which are needed for the treatment of patients in hospitals and clinics. The topic of Lecture 29 is evaluation of biocompatibility clinical trials. The two important prerequisites for clinical trials are the following. First, all other steps of the biocompatibility evaluation process must be completed successfully before clinical trials are even contemplated. The second new and crucial requirement is that clinical trials must be reviewed and must be approved by regulatory agencies such as the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. What is the Food and Drug Administration? It is a regulatory agency which was established following the so-called Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. This is a law which was passed by the United States of America Congress and became the first consumer protection law in this country. Subsequent amendments expanded and strengthened the 1906 law. The FDA, which is the abbreviation for Food and Drug Administration, is a government agency which reviews food, drugs, cosmetics, animal food, dietary supplements, medical devices, of course, biological goods, and biological products. The mission of the Food and Drug Administration is set by the United States of America Congress. And some of the important aspects pertinent to our course are that the Food and Drug Administration is responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, and medical devices, and by ensuring the safety of our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. What does the FDA do? Of course, it is striving to comply with the mission which was dictated to it by the United States government. And the key words in that particular mission are two words: safety and efficacy of drugs and devices. Safety has been a term which all people can understand and have a specific idea of what it means. The word efficacy has been a term which has been interpreted in different ways by different people. The key words again in the mission of the FDA have been safety and efficacy. At the same time, the FDA is striving to not slow down or prevent innovations for new medical products, which of course can help patients. So in this respect, FDA has two important aspects to achieve: to assure safety and efficacy, but should not delay and prevent innovations for new medical products and devices. FDA, of course, is a regulatory authority. It oversees the safety and efficacy of drugs and medical devices before such products are approved for marketing in the United States of America. Keep in mind that in order to have a product which is going to be sold in global markets, the FDA regulations and approval might not be enough. The requirements and standards of other regulatory agencies in other countries and parts of the world must be considered. Examples of such regulatory agencies are the following: the International Organization for Standardization, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the Japanese Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, etc. The requirements and standards of these organizations must be observed, and pertinent additional approvals must be obtained if the particular biomedical device will be sold in global markets. Applications requesting clinical trials must first be submitted to and approved by the FDA. These applications include the following information: the results of successful completion of all preceding biocompatibility evaluation stages, including all in vitro and animal studies. Detailed information regarding the device, specifically how it's manufactured, how it was assembled, what is the material content of that device, etc. Detailed description of the protocols which will be used during the clinical trials. All information regarding the term of participating health care personnel, including the doctors, nurses, etc., the training credentials of this personnel, all other healthcare-related credentials, expertise, etc. In addition, information regarding the hospital or hospitals, more than one, where the proposed clinical trials will be conducted must also be provided. The various stages of the clinical trials are known as phases, with Roman numerals: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. The very special and important aspect of all clinical trials is the fact that human volunteers participate in all stages of the clinical trials. Special cases which precede even phase 1 clinical trials are those which require emergency use authorization. The rationale behind such requests are humanitarian reasons. Attending physicians, for example, may apply to the FDA for authorization in order to use a new product or device whose compatibility evaluation has not been completed or approved yet for special so-called emergency use. In this case, the attending physicians must prove that they have exhausted all other available treatments or options, that the patient is very sick, and that the prognosis for survival of the specific patient is extremely bad. When FDA authorization is given, the new product or device is used only in one patient. The results or outcome in most of these cases is that the volunteer patient's condition may improve for a short time, but death is inevitable. Valuable information, however, is obtained regarding the performance of the device in the human body. An example of such a particular emergency use authorization was the first time when the artificial heart was used to be implanted, and replace the heart of a patient whose condition was very, very bad. This was a case in the 70s, and it was a patient who was treated in a hospital in South Africa. That was a revolutionary new concept, to have a device composed of synthetic materials to replace a very valuable organ. The particular recipient was very sick. The synthetic device helped him for a very short period of time, but of course the patient unfortunately passed away. However, the information which was received by the attending physicians and researchers was extremely valuable, because that was the very first example of replacing a human organ with a device which was composed of synthetic materials. The Food and Drug Administration, as well as the similar regulatory agencies in other countries around the world, provide detailed information of their requirements, which must be followed during clinical trials. For the purposes of our course, however, we are going to review certain important key characteristics of the various stages of the clinical trials. The various phases 1, 2, 3, and 4 must be followed in a sequential manner. The number of patients, duration of the studies, the number of hospitals where phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials are conducted increases in each one of the aforementioned stages. Phase 4 trials investigate and evaluate safety over long periods of time and involve many patients. The results of each completed phase are reported to the FDA for their review and approval before continuing on the next phase of the clinical trials. Clinical trials are extremely important for completing the process of evaluating the biocompatibility of implantable materials and devices. Successful completion of the clinical trials could lead to approval by the FDA and other regulatory agencies, and thus the tested product can reach the market, the clinics, the hospitals, where patients who need these new products can benefit from these new developments. In order to obtain the approval of the FDA and other regulatory agencies, what a clinical trial must prove are two things. First and foremost, the clinical trials must make a very strong case of the benefits of the new product, and at the same time must prove that there are no unusual risks which may jeopardize the welfare and the health of the receiving patients. Only when those two aspects are addressed satisfactorily to the regulatory agencies, then the pertinent approval is obtained and the tested product can reach the medical market. In addition to scientific standards and criteria, clinical evaluations of biomedical devices must comply with legal regulations. All those regulations, of course, are the ones required by the FDA and by all the other committees through the various stages of the evaluation of the biocompatibility of devices. We should keep in mind, however, of another aspect. Failures of clinical evaluations are reported many times in the popular press. And as a result of that, they become the subject of major litigation. Lawyers put together groups of patients who suffered because of the failure of the new product during clinical evaluations, or they bring together families of people who lost their lives as a result of receiving the wrong new medical device. And of course, these particular litigations reach the popular press. They attract a lot of attention. And the fact in the United States is that any time litigation was brought for a product, a drug, an implant device, etc., to court and to jury kind of trials, the patients and their lawyers received major compensation in terms of incredibly large amounts of money for all their suffering and the tribulations which they suffered. All stages of the clinical trials have special and unique requirements. First and foremost, safety and efficacy of the tested devices when they're implanted or come into the body of human subject is of paramount importance. The rights and dignity of the human subjects who are participating in the clinical trials should always be protected. Patients must give their informal consent before they participate in a clinical trial. Ethical considerations are involved in the selection of patients who will participate in these trials. In this particular aspect, we should remember that in order to have scientifically sound studies, we have to have two groups of participating patients. One group will receive the new device or the new drug or the new vaccine, but the control group will receive, in the case, let's say, of the drug placebo, which is perhaps a pill made out of sugar, or instead of an injection of the new vaccine, an injection of isotonic saline. Who among the patients would end in either one or the other group? This is where the ethical consideration come into play, because the people who will receive the new vaccine, the new drug, the new device will benefit, while the other people who are equally in need of such new development will not have that particular benefit. And last but very important aspect, special requirement for the clinical trials, is that the identity and medical records of participating patients must remain confidential forever. That is why when the results of clinical trials are reported, no names, not even the initials of the names of the patients are reported. Each participating patient usually is given a number, and therefore that's how that particular patient is referred to in all aspects of the clinical trials. Another way things are done in that respect, in order to protect the confidential aspect, is the following. If, for example, in medical surgical conferences, the attending doctors and surgeons present photographs of the various parts of the body of the patient, they avoid showing the face or any other characteristic which may identify the patient whose photograph is shown on the screen. And if the particular surgical or medical procedure involves the face, what is done is to cover the eyes of the person and part of the body with a black ribbon. So again, the identity of the patient remains confidential forever. The FDA and other similar regulatory agencies require that applications for clinical trials which are submitted to them include all kinds of records of all the stages which were investigated as part of establishing the biocompatibility of the new biomaterial and device, which means that all the results of the in vitro test, the tests in vitro with cellular models, and the results of the animal trials should be submitted to the FDA or the other appropriate regulatory agencies in other countries. This is a voluminous task. Piles and piles and boxes on boxes are put together and submitted to the FDA for that particular support of the application for clinical trials. This requirement, of course, brings about the need for very meticulous, continuous, and very careful keeping of records of all the research aspects. So complete and detailed records of all the tests must be kept and must be available for inspection and or submitted to the regulatory agencies as and when required. These records include description of the device, protocols of surgical procedures which were used either for the animal trials or the other pertinent procedures, post-operative care and medical care of the recipients, comparisons of the trial results with appropriate controls. Always, it's very important at all stages of the process of evaluating the biocompatibility of materials and devices to have comparison of the results with appropriate controls. Without them, statistical analysis cannot be completed, and therefore the significance of the results cannot be evaluated and appreciated. All the special and extra requirements regarding clinical trials are justified because clinical trials are the ones which establish the ultimate biocompatibility of implant biomaterials and devices inside the human body. Successful completion of these trials are, of course, required in order to obtain approval from the regulatory agencies and thus bring the biomedical devices to market and to patients. Compared to the preceding stages of the evaluation of the biocompatibility of materials and devices, clinical trials have some special aspects and requirements. Ethical considerations are unique and very sensitive issues of the clinical trials. The ethical considerations, of course, pertain to a major and critical decision of who among the volunteer patients will be receiving the new device, the new drug, the new vaccines, and who will be receiving a placebo, which in the case of drug is a pill made out of sugar. In the case of vaccines, perhaps is an injection of isotonic saline. The first group of patients will have a chance of receiving the benefit of the new development, while the group of the people who end in the control group were not gonna have that particular benefit. The clinical trials have many facets, and they are very demanding from the scientific point of view. they require investment of lots of time and money. They're expensive. Unfortunately, do not always result in marketable products because even after all the previous stages of the biocompatibility evaluation process have been successful, clinical trials may fail and therefore the product cannot be approved, or if it is at some phase of the clinical trials, the clinical trials must be stopped, and again, the product must be removed from consideration for approval and marketing. In conclusion, evaluation of the biocompatibility of implantable materials and devices is a process of various stages which must be completed in sequence in order to establish the safety and efficacy, which are two very important aspects of the concept of biocompatibility. The first steps, specifically the in vitro, ex vivo, and animal tests, provide valuable information regarding biocompatibility, but they cannot predict the performance of implants and devices in humans. For that purpose, clinical trials are needed. Successful clinical trials are required before any biomedical device and product becomes commercially available to the patients who need them. Last but not least, we should be reminded that the process of the biocompatibility of implant materials and devices, especially at the clinical trial stage, comes with legal requirements and associated liabilities. Evaluation of the biocompatibility of implantable materials and devices is a major part and sometimes a major focus of the careers of many biomedical engineers. It is possible that some of you may deal with biocompatibility aspects and or devote your career exclusively in evaluating the biocompatibility of materials and devices which are part of the products of the companies where you're going to be working. For starting this particular process, I want to assure you that you can be comfortable in knowing that such information is available by the publications of many regulatory agencies and various agencies and professional organizations. These sources have compiled and regularly update detailed instructions regarding the protocols and the methods which are pertinent to each stage of the process for evaluating the biocompatibility of implantable materials and devices. One thing that we must keep in mind, of course, is that all biocompatibility evaluations should be conducted in accordance with institutional regulations and must comply with state, federal, and international regulations and laws. This is the end of Lecture 29, Evaluation of Biocompatibility, Clinical Trials.